Here's the argument that I get all the time is, well, Sam, like, why would you want to pay off your mortgage when, the interest rate's super low, inflation's at 7.5%. And a lot of this thinking comes from bond investing is like during a high inflation environment, when you're locked in with a 10-year bond, like you're kind of out of luck because inflation kind of chews out all the yield that you're supposed to earn.
What's the number one secret, Sam, to avoiding the mortgage interest trap or avoiding these never-ending interest payments from the banks?
Yeah. So I got into this thing a while ago. You and I both, like, we go to seminars and conferences and we just learn from a lot of people who are best. And one thing that I'm always curious about is how the banking system works, right? The United States and pretty much any country that has a central banking system, it follows a very similar pattern. But I got really fascinated with banks because by and large, banks have a lot of power, not just politically, financially, but they have a lot of power. And so I began studying, like, how does the bank make their money? Especially, you look at back in the 80s and like late 70s, interest rates were like 16%, right? Like you got a mortgage, you were paying a 16, 17% mortgage. CDs and savings rates were like 12%. And so compare that to like now these days where, the Fed just raised rates, but like still the interest rate's pretty low, like 3, 4, 5%. It's still lower than the 80s. So my question started with, like, how are the banks still making money? In fact, banks are actually making more money than ever before, I would argue, in the history of, the last 100 years. So when I start with the statement of like, hey, you should pay off your mortgage, a lot of people call me Dave Ramsey and all that. I'm like, no, not necessarily. Like, here's the argument that I get all the time is, well, Sam, like, why would you want to pay off your mortgage when, the interest rate's super low, inflation's at 7.5%. And a lot of this thinking comes from bond investing is like during a high inflation environment, when you're locked in with a 10-year bond, like you're kind of out of luck because inflation kind of chews out all the yield that you're supposed to earn. So that's kind of the thought process from that. And the other argument I get all the time is, with Sam, like, why not take any extra money that you're throwing in your mortgage and invest it into S&P 500, Dow Jones, where like the last year we got a nominal return of 8 to 12%. And all those are valid truth. Like there's definitely truth in that. But one thing that they miss all the time, because they come up with that argument based on technical readout, but not necessarily the social economic changes that we've experienced the last 40 years. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the social economic patterns, how often we move, and what are some of the, for those that are married, like what are the gender roles are like now? How does that ultimately translate to fiscal differences between 40 years ago and now? So for those that have been around for a while, you've lived through the 80s and maybe even the 90s, the days of you working for a company for 40 years and retiring and expecting the company to take care of you is long over. That's like 50s and 60s thinking, right? I think Goldman Sachs is one of the companies that kind of broke that. So now these days, I think there's an HR survey that was done a couple of years ago that the average person changes 7 careers in their lifetime, which is insane. Right? Long time ago, we used to do this thing where you stuck with that one career, you mastered it, you got really good at it. And then like, that was the pride and joy of your life. But now these days, especially like in 2022 and 2023, like the characteristics of success, I think now is how well you adapt and how well you change. And same thing with this fact that the US Census Bureau says that the average US adult moves 11.7 times in their lifetime. So if you extrapolate that data to where if you live to be about 80 years old, you would essentially move 7 to 8 times, or every 7 to 8 years, right? So here's the problem when it comes to your mortgage and how that all kind of fits together. If you were to look at mortgage lending, the mortgage lending industry almost 40, 50 years ago, you weren't really seeing a whole lot of people borrow on a 30-year amortization. It was often 5 years, 10 years, 15 at max, right? 15, people thought back in the day, 15 was a long time. So most people borrowed using 5-year amortization. They would do like 50% down, right? It was pretty characterized. It was characterized by a big down payment, short amortization, get it paid off as soon as possible. And then it wasn't until 70s and 80s when some of these savings and loans establishments now, which is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, started to come up with securitizing mortgages and offering refinances, making the amortization longer. Now, some places in California, you got 40-year amortizations, which is like insane to me, right? But here's where I'm getting at. Okay, I just laid out all the ingredients to make a sandwich here. I'm gonna put the sandwich together. So if we were to explain this fact of the average person moves every 7 to 10 years or 7 to 8 years, I would say, and most people, like 90% of today's lenders, borrow on a 30-year amortization. If you look at a 30-year amortization chart, the vast majority of the interest that you pay happens where? The first 10 years, right? We call it the front-loaded interest zone. And you don't have to believe me. Just go look at any mortgage calculation, and you'll notice that bulk of the interest you do pay happens in 10 years. Most people think it happens linearly, meaning they pay equal amount of interest every year, right? Which is not true. You actually pay a substantial amount of interest the first 5 to 10 years in any given mortgages. So try this, right? 7 to 10 years, you move. The first 10 years, you pay most of the interest. What is the combination of that? Well, what it looks like is if you live in it, you buy a house, you live in it, you've been paying most of the interest, and on the 7th year, you decide to list your home, sell it, get another house, get a brand new mortgage, a brand new 30-year mortgage. Guess what you just did? You made it to that critical point where you're almost out of the interest-heavy point on your mortgage, but now you just cycled all the way back to the beginning, where vast majority of your new interest, your mortgage payment, is now yet again interest.
It's like playing Monopoly, right? And you just went all the way around, and you got Boardwalk and Park Place, and you're like sitting pretty good, and all of a sudden, you're like, oh, you go to jail and you lose your houses that you have on there.
Right. Except so most people, they buy a home, get a mortgage, sit on it for 7 years, make their payments, and really they've been forking a lot of money for the interest, and then they sell a home, get a new house, start all over. And they do this every 7 to 10 years. Now, if it isn't that, right? If you're lucky to be around the same place forever, what most people did in the last 2 years, especially when Fed dropped the rate down to 0, they went out and got a refinance loan. Now, if you look at the situation, most people have spent already 3 to 5 years in paying down your mortgage, and then 2020 came. We had a massive refi boom. But the trap there also is if you do decide to refinance into another 30-year mortgage, you're starting that process all over, back to square one, albeit that you have lower interest, rate and a smaller payment, but you just push back, you're in that first tenure of your mortgage amortization schedule all over again.
So if I'm hearing you, Sam, you're saying you got to understand what's actually costing you. So you define really what's happening here. Don't be allured by what you think inflation's going to do for you, or that your payment is just X, Y, or Z, right? And it's really, you got a heavy interest. So